come now to a very interesting transition. The transition is from Thucydides and Benjamin Franklin to Tacitus and St. Teresa of Avila. And I'm trying to underscore here what a tremendous change there is, and yet there's a continuity. The change from Thucydides to Tacitus is the change from Greek democracy of the classical period of the 400 BCs to the Roman Empire of the 1st century AD. So while there's about 500 years in time difference, there's all the political difference in the world. Thucydides writes about a time when there was a nascent development of a valuation on the individual which was unparalleled. Before Thucydides, the only individuals that really recorded historically in fullness were certain kings or conquerors who tended to become kings. But Thucydides makes real, for the very first time, a history where individuals like we are become fully rounded and presented. In Tacitus's time, the Roman Empire made it very clear that only the emperor was real, and only those who were in the good graces of the emperor enjoyed a borrowed reality, and only those who were tied into the power lines of the application of the emperor's reality had likewise some kind of portion. So that the Roman Empire is a colossal regression. Now we'll see a difference between Benjamin Franklin and Teresa of Avila, but let me just stay with Thucydides and Tacitus, with Greek democracy and with the Roman Empire. In order to understand what has happened here, in order to get a picture of why it's important to us, you need to know that when time is historical, when temporality has a historical quality to it, it has a finite form. When time is mythic, it does not have a finite form. Mythic time is renewed every time the rituals that sustain it are performed. So that a culture in a mythos, as long as they sustain their rituals, that cultural form continues. It isn't time dated. And so mythic time for all practical purposes is indefinite. It's not eternal, it's not infinite, it's indefinite. And one could be tempted to say that mythic time was boundless, but it isn't boundless. It's bounded by the rituals arranged usually in an annual year. So the annual year is the wheel. And as long as that wheel continues to turn, mythic time continues to exist unabated, unaffected by any kind of vicissitudes or any kind of change. There are many cultural qualities for the Jews, for the Chinese, for the Hindus. There are many mythic qualities that are the same as they have been for thousands of years, while other historical aspects have changed radically. So that historical time is always a time form which is finite. Now, no one knew this in the ages before Thucydides, and as soon as Thucydides had written his history of the Peloponnesian War, the first generation of very alert, smart, penetrating Greeks in the city of Athens, that very first generation, began to pay attention to what size are historical forms, and the genius of that whole era was Plato. And one of Plato's enduring, famous achievements was the establishment of what still is known as the Platonic year. The Platonic year is not the same as the annual ritual year. The annual ritual year is the course of the sun in one complete revolution, or the course of the moon in 12 permutations. It is always the same. It is always based on the motion of the sun, the moon, and occasionally very large mythic qualities were based on the movements of stars like Venus or Sirius. Occasionally. Not too often, but occasionally. The Platonic year is a definite time historical form, and it lasts for about 2,160 years. And within that, and you can think of it roughly as a 2,000-year period, a pair of millennia, that a historical epoch, as the Scots used to call it, an epoch, or an era, as the English used to call it, or using the ancient Greek term that was used in Hellenistic times, the aeon, or the term that is more appropriate perhaps for our purposes, the Platonic year, was a 2,000-year period, and it was specifically and exactly divided into four 500-year periods. That every 500 years some change would occur, like a change of gear. And this change of gear was always a gearing down. And that at the end of 4 of these 500-year periods, at the end of gearing down, the 4th gear was the lowest, and one would shift back into high. Now, the place where this particular quality of time duration having a limited form is ensconced is in the writings of a contemporary of Virgil named Ovid. Virgil is just one lifetime before Tacitus, sort of the era just before Tacitus. So Ovid comes into play just before Tacitus. Ovid's book called the Metamorphoses, the metamorphoses, the transformations, the changes, the Roman book of changes is Ovid's Metamorphoses, just like the Chinese I Ching. So the Roman I Ching is written by Ovid, and it, in 15 books, shows all the cycles of myth. Notice that it is not a mythic work in itself, but its subject matter is myth, myths and mythic cycles. But its overall view is to understand that the entire realm of mythic cycles belongs under the power, the control, the aegis of the Platonic year. And in Ovid, in order to get it across, because it was very new to the Romans didn't understand this at all. The Greek mind, after several hundred years of Hellenistic commentaries on Plato, understood this very well. The Roman mind was blocky, slower, suited to build roads, suited for engineering projects, suited for military escapades with well-formed legions, not at all subtle. The Latin language is not at all subtle for these things, whereas the Greek language is. The Roman language mind was so blocky that Ovid, in order to get across this four-part Platonic year, the quaternary structure of the aeon and how it gears down, said that the first 500-year age was the age of gold, the second 500-year age was the age of silver, the third 500-year age was the age of brass, and the fourth was the age of iron. So that the metals become less and less value. And when one gets to iron, one gets to some kind of basic, primitive, foundational metal, and one does not gear down from iron. When the Iron Age, when the 500-year period of that age characterized by the qualities of iron have run their course and can no longer be sustained, no matter what men do, no matter what rituals men do, when a historical time period is over, it is finished. It cannot have any more power or efficacy. When the age of iron is over, a complete turn, a revolution happens, and one returns back to an age of gold. So that every 2,000 years is a tremendous revolution in civilization when a new age of gold comes upon the experience of mankind, and they have a 500-year period within which to do the very best that they can. And then another 500-year period, somewhat less, a third 500-year period where things are very difficult, and a fourth 500-year period where they don't seem to work very well at all, and finally come to a halt. Nothing seems to work. And then, all of a sudden, there's a complete change, and the very next year is the beginning of a whole new aeon. Now, Tacitus, in writing in the 1st century AD, is supposed to live in the first generation of the Age of Gold. This was the understanding. This was the historical understanding. Yet Tacitus, in his histories, are full of the most violent, macabre, regressive activities on human record up to that time, probably still unparalleled. Rome at the time had a population of about 2 million people, and about half those people were technically homeless and on the dole. The favorite entertainment was to watch human beings suffer. Gladiatorial shows were the talk shows of the age. Violent, horrible, unfair death was the entertainment of the Roman personality of the time. Megalomaniac, panic-striking, terrific, demonic qualities in the psychology of the rulers was the highest power source in the Roman Empire of Tacitus's day. And so Tacitus is the historian who's trying to find a way to balance these completely contradictory things. The world that he saw was super corrupt, and yet it was supposed to be the beginning of an age of gold. And so all the way through Tacitus, you find behind the scenes is this great, calm, mature intelligence looking carefully, accurately, again and again, to try to find the pieces that would add up to an age of gold. And yet on the surface, one finds this blunt language, almost like a catastrophically simple syntax, showing again and again by blunt juxtapositions Tacitus's Latin is one of the glories of world literature. If you can read Tacitus in Latin, I could do that when I was maybe 15, not now, but Tacitus's Latin is like a non-stop pyrotechnical show. It's like Sylvester Stallone in one of his great Rambo roles. The language just bluntly bludgeons again and again, but on a very high level, the whole notion that there's any semblance of humanity in what's going on or in who's participating. The world is perfectly choreographed to be a nightmare. And people are rushing on all sides to participate in this and will do anything to get to the top to be able to accelerate it. So Tacitus's work is this tremendous contrast between the search for an underlying age of gold in the midst of a carnival of terror. Now, Tacitus lived long enough to see the Roman Empire gain stability, but it gained stability not until the 2nd century, well into the 2nd century AD, under the Emperor Trajan. And one reason that Trajan was able to maintain his equanimity is that he didn't go into Rome. He didn't go into the city. Trajan learned that Rome was a psychological infectious disease. And as long as he didn't go into the city, he was able to maintain his plain greatness. And under Trajan, the Roman Empire was spread as far as it ever got. It went from Ireland to India, and from Scandinavia all the way down into the Sahara, and there were Roman outposts as far away as Vietnam. And the successor to Trajan, instead of choosing his own family, his own bloodline, he chose a man that he adopted named Hadrian. And he specifically chose Hadrian because Hadrian was prepared. He was highly cultivated. He was exquisitely feeling-toned. Hadrian was one of the most sensitive men to ever occupy a position of world power. And Trajan made it clear to Hadrian, as long as you stay out of the city of Rome, you will be able to rule. And so Hadrian's rule was also a great age because he never went into the city. And Hadrian was elegant enough to be able to understand that there were certain limits. Instead of taking the old Roman ethos that any enemy will be beaten and destroyed and vanquished, Hadrian is famous, for instance, in northern England, of building a wall called Hadrian's Wall between Scotland and Britain. Hadrian's Wall is still there. And Hadrian's Wall is one of these great civilized markers that shows someone who has world power is recognizing that their power extends only to here. There's a kind of a grand humility in Hadrian. And so with Trajan and Hadrian, the 2nd century becomes the great age of Rome, because the rulers set aside for a while the whole idea of power, the whole idea of ruling from Rome. And following Hadrian, you have the grandest age of Rome. It's called the Age of the Antonines. And that age has 3 or 4 emperors, ending with Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. And so the 2nd century of the Roman Empire is one of great handling of power. It's like a large corporation that finds its maturity and has experienced people running it and simply runs well and runs grandly. I remember in the early 60s, I worked for a while for the head office in San Francisco for Metropolitan Life. And in the 30s and 40s and 50s, Metropolitan Life as a corporation was one of the great examples of a stable power group. When I was there in 1963, they were investing $1 million a day. They built places like Park La Brea here in Los Angeles. But Metropolitan Life was an example of the great American corporations, well run, very stable, because all of the upper echelon leaders had come in at the same time during the Hungry 30s, during the Depression. And they all understood basic human values, so that all Metropolitan Life employees, after working for about an hour, got a free coffee break with complimentary rolls and coffee in case they hadn't had breakfast. There was always a time in the afternoon when they were given time to just stand up and stretch and just chat around their desks. So it was an example of a great corporation knowing how to handle power, but in a way where you were respectful of people and also respectful of the level of power that you actually had. So the age of the Antonines in Rome, the age from Hadrian and Trajan and so forth, was an age when Rome learned how to handle its power gracefully. But the 1st century AD is the age that Tacitus writes about. And here there is a psychological disease. And this disease is an archetypal infection. It's a fever. It's a fever born of millennial expectation, millennial fever, apocalyptic disease. Towards the end of Virgil's life, when he was asked by Augustus to write the Aeneid, which we're reading as one of our year-long texts, to find some way, like Homer had been the firm basis for Greek civilization, Virgil's Aeneid was going to be the firm basis for the Roman civilization that would last for at least 2,000 years. And towards the end, when Virgil was finishing the Aeneid, putting the finishing touches, he never quite lived to finish it completely, he wrote an eclogue. It's a literary form like a hymn. He called the Messianic Eclogue, the 4th Eclogue, where he predicts that under a certain special star, a Savior of the world will be born in the Near East, and that this Savior will usher in the Age of Gold, and that this Age of Gold will be, at first, not seeable by ordinary men, but only by subtle human beings. And slowly, the elect, those subtle who could see on what basis there was an Age of Gold, would slowly inherit the earth from the false. This Messianic Eclogue sticks again and again in the psychic craw of the Roman emperors. Augustus Caesar had already achieved the power by the time the Messianic Eclogue came out, and so he did not expect it to apply to him. He ruled for 44 years and was just simply never opposed once he gained power. His son Tiberius, his adopted son Tiberius, became an astrology freak because he was trying to determine, was it he or was it someone else who was fated by a special star to be the Messiah of a whole new aeon, of a whole new Platonic year. And Tiberius's favorite personal pastime was exposing the false astrologers. And he had a technique. He would go down to one of his villas down by Naples, just off the Isle of Capri, and he would take them up to an observation deck, and he would say to them, I want you to predict by the stars what will happen in the next hour. And of course, what was going to happen in the next hour is that they were to be killed. And anyone who did not predict his death was simply killed. This went on until some astrologer, whether he got wind of what was happening or not, actually predicted his own death And he willed and ceded all of his property to the emperor on the spot. And of course, Tiberius chose him as his personal astrologer. He lived, prospered, and had power. Do you get it? Are you understanding what's happening here? When Tiberius died, there was a mad scramble to become the Messiah. And the emperor that came right on the heels of Tiberius was Caligula. And Caligula was one of the most desperate characters in world history. Absolutely psychotic. His reign lasted for a little over 4 years, and he was just finally put out of the way by people that could no longer even deal with his psychosis. But in Caligula's short reign, it was pointed out that the place where the Messiah would come from was either Jerusalem or Alexandria. And so in Alexandria, Caligula made sure that his image was in all the religious buildings of the time, so that if the gods or God would come home on any particular day, they would find the image of Caligula. He was nominating himself by these images of himself to be elected the Messiah. The people that did not go along with him in Alexandria were the Jews of Alexandria. And for the very first time in Alexandria, there was anti-Semitism, specifically on this issue, that they would not endorse Caligula as the Messiah. The leader of the Jews in Alexandria at the time, Philo, led an expedition of 5 mature men to the city of Rome to have an interview with Caligula, to present their case that they were being unjustly treated. How unjustly? All their property was confiscated. All the male Jews were herded into the stadium in Alexandria and not allowed to leave. They were only fed because the women were able to beg food and take food to them, and many other things. This for the very first time. Caligula received the deputation not on the Palatine Hill, not in the Roman Forum, but he was touring some apartment buildings that were being built on the outskirts of Rome, and he allowed them to tag along. And they would try to present their case to him as he rushed from room to room, level to level, looking to see whether the decor was just right. This is how he heard their deputation. And then in the midst of that, he turned upon them, a la Tiberius, and said, "If you do not worship me, on this spot you will never worship me. You worship me or you die." And Philo records the actual eyewitness life, you are there moment. And Philo said that the 5 Jewish men from Alexandria simply froze, paralyzed, and let their arms fall to their side, color drained from their faces. And he said some timeless moment passed by, and this terrificness passed through them. Their complete surrender submission, Caligula took to be some kind of form of Jewish worship, and he let them go. Truth. When Caligula was murdered, it became apparent to the next Roman emperor, Claudius, that it was too complicated a situation to judge and to tell, and that he could survive by letting people play off each other. And of course, Robert Graves' great novel, I, Claudius, and the sequel to it, done up into a TV miniseries, presents that world of Claudius. One of those intriguers got the throne, and that was Nero. And Nero expected that he was, without a doubt, the Messiah. And finally, came to a point in his psychosis where he realized that what was standing in his way was the sheer, brute, physical presence of the old Rome, and so he had it burnt to the ground so that he could plan a new Rome for the Messianic Age of Gold, of which he would be the star Messiah. Nero was killed. And 3 other men in the same year tried to be emperor, and they were all killed. So there were 4 emperors in the same year, until a man named Vespasian completely removed the Caesar line. He said, from Julius Caesar to Nero, the Caesar line has been the infection, and so our family, which are the Flavians, will take over from the Caesars, from the Julian clan. And at the time, Vespasian was in Alexandria, and they arranged a number of miracles. Vespasian would take his spit and he would merge it with the Alexandrian dust and put it on the eyes of blind people, and they were able to see once it was washed clean. Many other miracles like that. There are as many miracles recorded for Vespasian as for Jesus. It was the Roman blocky mind way of ascertaining divinity. Are there miracles? How many miracles are there? What kind of miracles are they? Are these documented miracles? It's the same path of becoming a saint today. It has to be documented. Better to be filmed, I think, now. But Vespasian got a cue from Nero that what was in the way, obviously, was the old energy still posited in a city. And it wasn't Rome that needed to be burned, but it was Jerusalem that needed to be burned. But just in case there was some curse hooked up with the burning and destruction of Jerusalem, Vespasian wisely let one of his sons do it. He let Titus do it, the younger son. And so the complete destruction of Jerusalem is tied up with Nero's burning of Rome. The destruction of the cities were the destructions of previous civilizations, because cities are the symbols of civilization. Religions in their ritual year are the ways in which cultures symbolize their mythic ethos. And as long as the ritual years are intact, the symbols will have juice, and between the symbols with juice and the rituals intact, the mythic ethos will go on indefinitely. The circles of mythic time will be renewed each year. But remember that historical time is always limited. It always has a form. It has a definite form. It has a beginning, it has an extension for a certain time period, and then it ends. So historical form is always a limited vehicle, as opposed to mythic time, which is circular and renewable as long as the ritual year is held intact, as long as the annual ritual year is intact. Now, when Tacitus came to write his histories of the first century of Rome, his very first work was called the Annals. And his second work is called the Histories. In other words, Tacitus, in his great genius, tries at first to characterize the Caesar line in terms of an annual ritual bias that did not work out. Then he turns his attention to the later developments, to the developments that are not an annual basis, not a ritual basis, but a historical conscious plotting. And so the histories of Tacitus are a record by the greatest historian of the time of the way in which world power flailed around with first the left hand and then the right in the 1st century AD. With the left hand, they tried to initiate the age of gold and become a Messiah by finally rubbing out Rome. And when that didn't prove to be effective, then the right hand, in a conscious way, choreographed a historical event, the dismantling and burning of Jerusalem, in order to usher in an age of gold and make Roman emperors messiahs. So the destruction of Rome and the destruction of Jerusalem are linked together, and they're only about less than 10 years apart in terms of actual historical time. They're linked in tandem. Now, what is peculiar about this is that Jerusalem was destroyed once before. Jerusalem was completely destroyed once before Titus destroyed it in 70 AD. Jerusalem was completely destroyed in 598 BC. And about 10 years before Jerusalem was destroyed in 598 or 604 BC, around in that era. There's a little bit of archaeological leeway. The other great civilization city that was destroyed within 10 years of Jerusalem back then was Nineveh. Nineveh was completely destroyed in 612 BC by the founder of the Neo-Babylonian empire, Nebuchadnezzar II. And Nineveh was, for more than 2,000 years, the great city, the capital of what had been Samaria, of what had been Akkad, of what had been the original Old Babylonia, of what had been Assyria. That whole civilization had had 4 great cycles. That civilization had 4 great cycles: an age of gold, an age of silver, an age of bronze, an age of iron. And with the destruction of Nineveh, it was completely wiped out. It never recovered. And with the destruction of Jerusalem about 10 years later, that whole earlier era of Jewish history was also erased. So in an odd way, in the 1st century AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed again, just 10 years after the destruction of Rome, it became apparent somehow that Jerusalem was mystically tied to the fate of world empire. That Rome was very much like Nineveh. It was an ancient city, had been there for 800 years by the time Nero burnt it down. It had risen to world power that was at least equal to that of Sargon of Akkad. But the common denominator between those 2 aeons, the aeon of 600 BC going back 2,000 years, the aeon of 100 AD going back 2,000 years, the common denominator was Jerusalem. So that Tacitus, in the histories, at the very end of what survives as the histories, we only have a truncated version. The complete work in all of its books has been lost. Some say conveniently lost. One of the last sections to survive is a section called the Jews. And so in Tacitus's history, one comes across the assessment from an archetypal standpoint and yet from a practical purpose, an assessment of what historical form meant vis-a-vis the Jews, implicating the Roman power, Roman world power. Here's how he writes it. Roman control of Judea was firmly established by Pompey. As victor, he claimed the right to enter the temple, and this incident gave rise to the common impression that it contained no representation of the deity. The sanctuary was empty, and the Holy of Holies untenanted. Just give you a little bit of background here. In the temple tradition, there was a front courtyard where anybody could come to give prayer. Then there was an inner part to the temple, a holy part of the temple, where only men could go in and give prayer. And then there was a third part called the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest once a year could go in on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So that the temple had a tertiary level. The first for all people, the second only for males who inherit the power lines, tribal, and the third only for the high priest, and only once a year and only once on that day. Pompey was the first non-Jew to make a diagonal straight into the Holy of Holies, and what he found was that there was nothing there, because the ancient understanding was that where God really is, man should not put any graven image whatsoever. So as long as you find images of idols, that's for public display, that's not for God's place. Later on, one of the revolutions of Jesus was saying that the Holy of Holies is the most quiet part of the mind, the soul, which is at the center, and only when that is completely opened does God ever come. And that the Holy of Holies is not in a building, but is in man, in the species, in the individual. Be that as it may, Pompey set a tone where Romans protected Judea, that it was some unusual place, and so Pompey made sure that the Roman power would stay there, but in a protected way. So while the walls of Jerusalem were dismantled in Pompey's time, this is about 60 BC, the shrine remained intact, and then during the Civil War, when the afflicted Roman world was split between the factions of Octavian, who became Augustus, on one side, and then Mark Antony and Cleopatra on the other. The eastern provinces were under the control of Mark Antony, and Judea for a while was conquered by a Parthian king, but the invader was killed, the Parthians driven back, and Mark Antony, being in control of Judea again, gave the control of the kingdom to Herod, so that Herod became the king of Judea, not through any Jewish line, but through a Roman power line, through Mark Antony. Not even a standard Roman power line, but through a rebellion. Mark Antony was a rebel trying to seize power. And that the power line, the power cord, was plugged into Cleopatra's Alexandria, the whole source of Mark Antony's power. So Herod, his kingdom, his whole power, in a way, is dependent upon Cleopatra's Alexandrian line. So there's a mystical tie between Alexandria and Jerusalem that comes to an apex, a peak, in the time of Herod. Now when Herod died, his kingdom was divided among three sons. And he died when Varus was governor of, Quintilius Varus was governor of Syria, and Varus was governor of Syria from 6 BC to 4 BC. So that Herod died around 4 BC at the very latest. So when it comes to dating Jesus, you have to understand that Herod died in 4 BC, and Joseph didn't bring Jesus back from Egypt until after Herod had died. And so Jesus is born long before 1 BC, 1 AD. Many years, 8-9 years before. When Herod died and his kingdom was divided into three, the portion that was held Jerusalem was one portion, the coastal cities was another, and the far north, the wild west of the day, Galilee, was a third. Now the portion that was on the seacoast was the economic power. That seacoast portion of Palestine was financed by one family from Alexandria, by Philo, Philo's older brother. And so Philo's family financed the making of beautiful ports of Caesarea, which was Herod's great port. So that you have a tremendous tie-in of Rome, Alexandria, and Jerusalem in the context of an apocalyptic fever, a millennial turn of the Platonic year, which was visible only for the very first time at this time. Nobody had seen this before. Nobody understood all of this before. And the only key was a scale of measurement of conscious historical time that was initiated by Thucydides. So that somebody of Tacitus's time, in order to understand what are we going through, what is all of this, had to go back to classical Greece, to Thucydides and to Plato, to be able to have some way to consciously measure what is the time scale we're delivering, what is the historical form that's coming to pass. Now with that, we better take a break. Let me come back. We stopped with Tacitus writing about the Jews, writing about Pompeii, writing about Roman power, writing about how there is no millennium in mythology. Mythological time is continuous. As long as the circle of ritual is maintained, it goes on and on. But historical time is always limited, so history always engenders an apocalypse. Always. And only with history. Now, what's peculiar about an apocalypse is that the writing, the language of writing about an apocalypse cannot be historical writing. You cannot use language in the historical process to talk about a millennial apocalypse. That language is always visionary. And that visionary apocalyptic language is so similar to certain kinds of mythic language as to be indistinguishable to someone who doesn't have experience. I mean, a lot of experience with consciousness with differential forms. Let's come back to our ecumeny outline for just one sentence. We're trying to appreciate and understand something which we ourselves are caught up in our own time. We live 2,000 years after these kinds of events, and we are going through a similar sequence as the 1st century AD. And so we're trying to understand something that didn't just happen back then, but something that happened for the first time back then and was not understandable historically by people at that time, but was recorded very accurately in visionary language of that time. And so the visionary language of the 1st century AD is very important to us as practical guideline of how to deal with our stuff. Here's the sentence. It's from page 29. It's from the page called Absorbing Experience. The sentence is this: the mythic horizon is concerned with absorbing experience. Think of a plane that's made out of a sponge. And what that sponge absorbs is experience. Now, visualize that the mythic horizon does not lay flat, but it curves. It curves exactly in the shape of the ritual year. And the ritual year curves exactly in the shapes of the annual year of nature, the 4 seasons. So that if you let those curves happen, they will curve around and they will make circles. They will make wheels. The natural cycle of the seasons, visualized in its totality, is a wheel of the seasons. The ritual annual year, which follows those seasons and rituals, also will be a wheel around a wheel. And the mythic horizon will be a third wheel around those 2 wheels. The first visionary language to describe seeing this numinously is in the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Ezekiel is the most mystical of all the prophets. Ezekiel's phrase is that he saw wheels within wheels way up in the sky. And Ezekiel is granddaddy champion, visionary, so trustworthy that you could bet your life on it. Ezekiel's very, very, very great. Where did Ezekiel write those words? He wrote them when he was on the banks of, he calls it the river Chubar, what the Chubar is the Tigris. He was outside the city walls of the new Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar. After Nebuchadnezzar had erased Nineveh, he built a new Babylon to be the place where world power would come to him in order to run his kingdom, because he didn't know how to run his kingdom, and he didn't want to have people that had the old mentality, the old Assyrian, the old Sumerian, the old Akkadian mentality. And so he appropriated very talented people, the Jews, from Jerusalem, and brought them. They didn't want to go. So they call it the exile. He called it the staffing of a new empire. That's the way Nebuchadnezzar was. His favorite portrait of himself was with a spear putting out the eyes of a guy kneeling in front of him, with other guys lined up. Ezekiel, when he writes about seeing wheels within wheels way up in the sky, he is using a visionary language for the very first time in history to describe a symbolic culmination of the natural ecology. And in order to describe that, instead of using a mythic language, he's using a visionary language, which is on a higher order. Symbols are more powerful than myths. Symbols are much more powerful than myths. Symbols tell mythic language what to do. But visionary language is much more powerful than symbols. Visionary language tells symbols what to do. And the only way to commandeer the power of visionary language in a comprehensive way is to put it in the hands of someone. And the whole purpose of a person, the power of the person in the universe, is to make sure that visionary language has a place of responsibility where it rests. Otherwise, visionary language has no bounds and could just run havoc over nature. No matter how much power and comprehension there is in the natural cycle, nature, ritual, myth, and symbol are all patsies compared to the power of visionary language. And so a visionary language can literally run havoc over natural forms. One charismatic, unconsciously brilliant madman can dominate, if not con, a culture, a cultural level, a tribe, people on that level, even on the symbolic level, endlessly. The greatest example I ever saw personally in the San Francisco of the mid-60s, I was teaching San Francisco State. A friend of mine said, "You've got to come up to Ukiah and hear this preacher. He's unconscious. He's unbelievable." And my friend had been a boy wonder in Wheeling, West Virginia. He'd been a preacher at 14 and was a very famous lawyer. He handled Huey Newton case with Charles Geary and a lot of things. He was fantastic. And I said, "Well, if you say he's great, he must be really something." We went out and we listened to him. It was unbelievable. His name was Jim Jones. Unbelievable. I mean, it was like tent-top charisma, but completely without any morals, without any form, without any boundary. And the population of people were absolute wide-open suckers. They had no defenses whatsoever. Only someone who had achieved personality, whose person was at home, had any kind of chance against that kind of power. I'm talking about magic language. Charismatic magic language, hands down. There's nothing you can do. I mean, 900 people were killed like that because he wanted it that way, including himself, not because he wanted it, but because that's the way that language run wild goes. It becomes destructive. When you have a magic power like consciousness, and it gains a language, you have to ground it in a person. Otherwise, it becomes like a plague. A non-personal magic consciousness is a dragon that jeopardizes everyone and everything. There's no way that you can deal with it on natural level. It's supernatural power. The most infamous recorded incident of it is the glossolalia, the speaking in tongues, of Simon Peter and all the others gathered together in this upstairs room in Jerusalem. The house was owned by John Mark's mother. On the descent of the Holy Spirit, they spoke in tongues. That's like magic language. But if there's no person there, if there's no art level to give it form, to give it objectivity, it's like a hurricane. Not only does it run away with everyone else, it runs away with you. So you're literally unchaining the dragon by having a transformation to consciousness without having the personality to ground it, to not tie it down, to give it form. But the processes of consciousness are differential, and just as visionary language is wild like that in terms of the inner world, History is like that in terms of the outer world. A history, once engendered, once the power of history is engendered, without a cosmos to ground it, it will run wild with people. It will be the same charismatic hurricane, and there isn't anything that anyone can do. The only level that has any kind of objective power over history is a cosmos. So that in the universe of consciousness, there are two objective stages that are necessary. One is the person, the other is the cosmos. Person and cosmos. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what religion you are. It doesn't matter how good or how bad you are. It's inconsequential. Why? Because when you go to higher powers, they index everything below them. They've got the telephone number of everybody who can do anything. And they simply X you out. Notice here, the mythic horizon is concerned with absorbing experience, wheels within wheels. This absorption is done through activities and then images associated with those activities. So that the mythic sponge wheel, absorbs experience through what we do, and then deeper, images associated with what we do. So that the imagination and ritual activity are what are absorbed by the ritual mythic wheels that are bent and laid on the form of the annual cycle. So that if you're looking at this from on high, not a bird's eye view, but a cosmic bird eye view, the great celestial eagle of Dante's Paradiso, if you're looking down upon this, you see that these levels, these circular levels, are transformatively linked together in such a way that actually there's a spiral. There's a spiral that comes up, and there's a second spiral that parallels it. So that when you're looking at it, it's as if you're looking down and you see circle imposed upon circle, and it's just like a core. Sometimes it's called the soul core. It's just like a cylinder, like a circle. The early crystallography of the structure of DNA, the double helix of DNA, when you look at a cross-section of it and you look down through the core, it looks like a mandala, like a circle with a mandala. It's only when you put it in three-dimensional form that you see that this is a spiral looked at from the top down. And that this spiral, at each wind around here, has a substrate that allows for this to happen. Now there's a sugar substrate for organic DNA and RNA. There is a substrate that happens in terms of nature and a substrate in terms of consciousness. But in our particular quality, the substrates differ. The substrate for the natural ecology is different from that of conscious ecology. They're different. In nature, in order for ritual and myth and symbol to happen, in order for this to go, there are relationalities that link together in an integrative way. But in consciousness, they do not link together integratively, but they expand in a differential mode. So that the form that you would see mathematically in terms of consciousness, actually they're called supermanifolds. Whereas in a arithmetic integral substrate basis, the way in which nature, in its stages, arrives at transformation are according to actual archetypal forms. In the Western philosophical history, they're called the 5 Platonic solids. They're actually Pythagorean, and they actually come from ancient Egypt. The cube, the sphere, the pyramid, these kinds of primordial solids are integrating stages that can actually be visualized. But in conscious differentiation, one cannot visualize. They're not visuable. They're not imaginable. So one can say, in a very peculiar way, the substrate of the natural process is the imagination. Imagery. Not only things, but activities. And one can have images of things and images of activities. And these images, operating in imagination, hold all the way through until the very last stage of integration. And the last stage of integration is acceptance, and sometimes it's called surrender. And it's subtle. It's not only the giving up of images so that one has no image, but it also, in a subtle way, is giving up the resistance to completing this. There's a lot involved, and when you get to St. Teresa, she's actually very good at describing exactly what this is. She knows very precisely. While imagination is the substrate of integration, the substrate of conscious differentiation is memory, which is different. But if memory is paralleled on imagination, if you use memory to visualize, then you have a problem. The problem is that there's always this tendency then to regress. It's like whatever mode you're using, that's the way this scenario is going to work out. And if you use memory to mimic imagination, to mimic the ways of imagination, then you're going to have a result that is limited to integration and not going to operate in the differential realm at all. This is why when it comes to being conscious about God, you should have no image whatsoever. I don't very often say don't, but this is absolutely, basically, universal principle. The graven image that you have is guarantee that there's no divinity there. That's the absolute guarantee. You've just written out lifetime guarantee. Only when you reject that graven image is there any chance. Nietzsche said, when the half-gods go, that's God's opportunity. Then God may come. Notice here that the religious imagination in the integration mode always seeks to have an image of the divine. And when you're dealing with a historical time frame which is a form, the image of God is always in terms of some archetypal variation of the self. And when civilization came into play, the dynamics of, we can't go into it all, but the dynamics of civilization, the way it came into play, focusing on a city, finally, the central synthesizing integration form that was the favorite choice to usurp the differential powers of history was the archetype of the divine king. And the archetype of the divine king came in with a figure that we know from history as Naram Sin. S-I-N. Naram Sin. Naram Sin was the grandson of Sargon the Great. And he lived around 2160 BC. From Naram Sin to Augustus Caesar is one Platonic great year, almost precisely. It's almost like looking up in the table, the graphic table. Oh, Platonic great years, yes. Naram Sin to Augustus Caesar. Naram Sin is the first king to put in the description of his title, carved on stela, rock, engravings, divine. It's the divine representative on earth of God. He's the first divine man. And that archetype of the divine king is the central synthesizing core of that whole Platonic great year millennium, 2160 BC up to Augustus Caesar died in 14 AD. And all that time, it worked. Not so much because it's a great idea, but because it actually was a functioning, synthesizing archetypal center. It held all the symbols together in the right way so that the myths could be integrated, so that you could get a visionary language that would be operative, so that there could be certain chances of personality forming, and then out of that would come historical processes. And all of that was okay as long as the cosmology that went with it was in place. But the cosmology of 2160 BC was absolutely out of date by the time of Jesus, by the time of the beginnings of the AD. By the 1st century AD, that old cosmology, which was actually a Semitic Akkadian ecology. Naram Sin was not Aryan, he was Semitic. So in a very peculiar way, that whole Platonic great year aeon was held together by a Semitic divine king archetype. That as the 1st century AD began to come into play, it simply didn't work anymore. It didn't work not because it was wrong, but because its time had ended. Its time form was over. It had no way to extend its application. No way whatsoever. One of the most poignant of all the classical works is a little treatise by Plutarch about why the ancient oracles no longer work. Plutarch was a master of the mysteries. He lived towards the end of the 1st century AD, and he was, like all people of that time, they were extremely disturbed because the ancient oracles that had worked for thousands of years no longer worked. The Delphic oracle no longer worked. All the oracles. And he records in there a very curious happening. That a returning boatload of pilgrims from Delphi was coming across the Adriatic Sea. And they were told by some old woman that when they came off the promontory just south of Brundisium, there's a promontory of the toe of Italy that goes out into the Adriatic, they were told to shout to the shore, to the wooded, non-populating shoreline, that the old gods were dead. And they did so. And they heard this tremendous sigh of wail from the shore. And they put a bark out to land and explore, and there was no one there. It was just the barren hillside. And Plutarch says it is the eerie way in which to express the reality that the old gods no longer speak to man. Or if they do, they speak in some new way that does an end run around oracles. Oracles are visionary language, magic language. God no longer will talk to man in visionary language, but will only talk to man in terms of historical process. This is why one of the most powerful realizations of the 1st century AD is that what we're dealing with is a God of history, not a God of revelation. And that if there is a revelation, it's a revelation about the mysteries of the structure of history and not about any kind of symbolic, mythic, ritual ethos. Now, 2,000 years ago, this was almost impossible for anyone to grasp. Even today, after 2,000 years, it's almost impossible for anyone in some kind of equanimity, in some kind of conscious, measured way, to understand, much less appreciate, well, what the hell is all this about? What does this amount to? It amounts to this, that we're caught in a storm, which is a historical tornado, and there is absolutely no shelter without a cosmos. So that one of the great triggers of the 20th century is the search to find some dependable cosmology, something which will objectively anchor this tremendous differential tornadic conscious energy that's been released and primed. And that the previous solutions, like Marxist-Leninist Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, those cosmologies are regressive. They go all the way back to ancient Sumerian ideals. They go back not only 2,000 years to the Roman Empire, but they go even farther back to the kinds of tyrannies that were there before there was any kind of conscious handling whatsoever. And because there's no way, there's no ratchet that stops this regression, they can go back into Neolithic times. And you find the tendency now more than ever for people to go back to Paleolithic cosmologies. Let's go back to the times when it's very basic. Food and the club. You're either going to eat with us on our terms, or we're going to keep you from it. Cave stuff, Neanderthal stuff. Nothing stops that whatsoever. There's no way for a kind of normal, quote, middle class, quote, personality to deal with this. There's no way for a superhuman personality to deal with this. There's no way for some mutant to deal with this. There's no way from an alien from some other star system, from some other kind of life form to deal with this. Because level of person is outclassed by this challenge. That's why we're using the music from Vaughan Williams' Symphonia Antarctica, the Scott expedition to the Antarctica. Sometimes human beings are outdistanced by the challenges. And so the response, a la Arnold Toynbee, there has to be a response able to handle the challenge, and the response to a historical hurricane is not to become a stronger and stronger person, not to become super duper Rambo. That's also ineffectual. And the dependence upon it is just plain stupidity. It doesn't matter how many machine guns you carry or how bare your 58-inch chest is. It's irrelevant. The only response that meets that particular challenge is a cosmos that holds true for the level of persons that can express an integration to a quiet interior vanishing point and can come out to a mythic horizon that keeps its curvature with ritual activities and the cycles of nature. When all of those are aligned together, then you have a kind of sinuous, truthful curve that not only rides out the hurricane of history, but simply uses it as a backwind and goes wherever we would like to go. Instead of trying to have super blanket to quiet down a hurricane, can use that energy, that power, that particular kind of dynamis to channel it in the right ways, and maybe channel is not a good word here, but to direct it so that we can vector ourselves into a wider differential universe. We're going to need the energies of the hurricane of history if we're going to even go back to the moon, much less other planets, much less other star systems. There's not enough energy in all the myths on this planet to take someone back to the moon. That process doesn't have enough energy to do that. The visionary energy that took us to the moon the first time was enough for a couple of trips. That was it. The visionary energy is out of gas. It was used up. It's not there anymore. So it has to be a historical energy. So you get a tremendous bonus as well as handling a challenge that can deface the quality of life for who knows how long. A regression who knows where it can go to. But turn that around so that one has not only an opportunity for life, but of tremendous life. And so we use Tacitus. We use the histories of Tacitus to focus upon the last time that this particular historical challenge happened, and some of the terms which were found at the time to be important in the characterization of what happened, and we pair Tacitus with St. Teresa of Avila, who comes about 1,500 years later. She comes 3/4 of another Platonic year later. She comes after 3 500-year periods afterwards. She's born in 1515. She's a contemporary of Cortez, from roughly the same area as Cortez. She's like a female Cortez, only instead of conquering a new hemisphere, a new world on the other side of an ocean, she found a way to conquer and to deal with the new world inside, the interior realms. She's like a Cortez of the interior realms. She wanted not only to do it for herself, but she had this tremendous urge to share it with others, that others should be able to have this. And though one could say individually she had a kind of a flaw in herself that she was always trying to please others, it worked to great advantage because she founded 17 different places in Spain in her lifetime where people could learn this, especially women, but also men. One of her students was St. John of the Cross. She's a very good teacher. She knows her stuff. She's a Cortez of the interior world, of that new world which was facing the beginnings of the last 500 years, the last age of iron. The worst was yet to come. The age of iron of the interior world was just beginning when St. Teresa was operating, and has gone downhill since then. Regardless of all the great men and women, the brutal fact is that the energy of that whole integration, that whole Platonic year, has not only run down, it's run out. It's not here anymore. It's gone. It's gone forever. It doesn't matter how shiny the equipment is. When you plug it in, there's no current. They'll never work again. So that the psychic appliances are never going to work with that old historical energy again. Never. So some new form has to be engendered, but cannot be engendered until it can be rooted into a cosmic, not just a cosmic vision, but a cosmos, a universe that holds together because differentially it's created, artistically made to hold together. That's what has been before us for at least 50 years. The longer that does not obtain, the less chance there is, in terms of a kind of a Keynesian possibility, of it happening. Before Keynes was a great economist, he was one of the world's greatest philosophers about probability, and his probability theory understanding is quite tremendous. The probabilities are becoming very slim now that it will happen in a good way. In the 1st century AD, Tacitus records for us how it happened in spite of every abuse. And it's a kind of a left-handed way of encouragement. One is reminded of the phrase that Frank Lloyd Wright once used when asked by a young Hugh Downs about 50 years ago. He says, well, what about everybody who's abusing your style of architecture? And he said, that's how men learn. They can't stand to credit somebody with genius. They learn by abusing it. And after abusing it long enough, they learn how it works through the play of abuse, and they come to cherish it reluctantly, but finally they do. And this is the tone of St. Teresa of Avila. She learned what to do by abusing. She was one of the most abusive people interiorly that ever lived. She was a genius at abuse. Here's a quotation from her, and you just get the tone, and then we'll leave it till next week. I want you to read chapters 11 and 12 if you can. It's about the first of 4 stages of prayer. Notice 4 seasons, 4 ages of man, 4 stages of prayer. Teresa is archetypally one of the great human beings of all time. But she got that way not by being super good or even just being normal. She got that way by being super abusive and idiotic to the point of almost dying. She almost killed herself. She says, now although, if they persevere, men may arrive more quickly at contemplation along this road, where they cannot work with the intellect, it is a very laborious and painful one. For if the will is left without employment, and love has no present object to occupy it, the soul remains without support or activity. Solitude and dryness give great pain, and stray thoughts attack most fiercely. People who are made like this need a greater purity of consciousness than those who can work with the intellect. So we use books as a substitute for the mental prayer that the intellect would have. And without the aid of reading, we would not be able to even persist for very long. So if you don't have super intelligence, what do you use? Books. They're made for that. The Latin name for books is codex, and the first codexes are made in the 1st century AD. The book is a conscious form made at the beginning of that aeon to deal with those problems. It's still effective. Book is still effective. But now we have to use paired books to get away from the defects that have since come in the last 2,000 years of using the book as a doctrine to club others with. When you use a pair, it's very hard especially a disparate pair. Disparate pairs are very hard to club somebody with because they don't retain their power unless you can get the relationality, and the relationality depends upon advanced consciousness. So more than often, you have your hands full with a pair of books rather than clubbing somebody with a doctrine. But here's St. Teresa. Let them be sure that once a woman who is even more bound than a man to lead a chaste life has lost her shame before God, she cannot be trusted in any way at all. What is more, to gain the gratification of her desires, and an affection inspired in her by the devil, a woman will hesitate at nothing. And after this follows an account of the sickness unto death that she went through, because this is the attitude she had, that once a human being, especially a woman, even comes to the image of sinning, they're untrustworthy forever. She had done this and she had to deal with herself. And her way of describing this, I won't go through it all, but I think if you read a little bit of 11 and 12, you'll see the cure that she came up with. I will talk next week about the illness of Teresa, her sickness unto death, leading to realization that she was at a dead end. Teresa and Tacitus are separated by 1,500 years, 3/4 of a conscious cycle, and we're using them together. And both of them are relevant to our time. Tacitus is a direct parallel to us. Teresa is a visionary forerunner of our situation. So we have the beginnings, and we have 3/4 through some kind of an insight. Both these together give us a profound way of understanding where we are now. And if you wrestle with that for the next 3 weeks, I think you'll become acquainted enough that you'll be able to get the way in which Thucydides and Franklin and Tacitus and Avila overlay each other in such a way that if we do it one more time, a third time, we will have some way of understanding how it is that historical conscious process as an energy operates. And so the third pair of books will be two individuals who made a monumental leap forward in understanding how history works, what it is that we're dealing with when we're dealing with this energy. And the third pair will be Jacob Burckhardt's The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy and Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of world history. Because the Renaissance and Hegel are direct line. Teresa comes in the Renaissance, and Hegel comes towards that period known as the Enlightenment, which was the end of that Renaissance period. And the last month of history will get sort of a tour de force of two powerful intellects understanding that when you're dealing with historical energy on conscious scale, you have to call it spirit. You cannot any longer give it some kind of mechanical name. It's not an indifferent measurement, but it has a personality tone to it that it didn't have before. Or if it had a personality tone that was projected upon it before, it now has a personality that's definitely there. You can say that God is mythically projected before, but as Hegel will show, there's no way, once one sees the energy that history has and its conscious quality, that one cannot say that there is no God there. But instead of having an image of who God might be, perhaps the best that we can do is just to open our hands and say, that the characterization that he gave originally to Moses is about the best that one can say. When Moses said, I'm going to have trouble selling this to the people, who shall I say sent me? The reply was, tell them I am that I am sent you.